Hello and a very warm welcome to the Harrogate Literature Festival. My name is Gerry Foley. I'm a broadcast journalist and interviewer. While it's a real shame that we can't all be in Harrogate, it is a delight to be able to continue the conversation online. And that's thanks in large part to our sponsors, Rayworth's solicitors in Harrogate, who've been sponsors since 2012. So thank you very much to Rayworth for the continued support of the festival. And the guest today is Loyd Grossman, and we're here to talk about his new book. It's called An Elephant in Rome, and it's really about the incredible relationship between Pope Alexander VII, who reigned from 1655 to 1667, and the master builder, designer, sculptor, architect, the genius that was Bernini. So, just before we get into the meat of the book, Loyd, firstly, congratulations. You turned 70 in September. You've worn many hats throughout your career. Is there any particular decade that you felt you were most satisfied personally and professionally?
So far, the current one.
Always good to live in the moment, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. Never look back.
Now, it says on the author's notes on the cover of the book that you normally spend a lot of time in Italy. These are not normal times. But most years, what percentage of the time would you be in Italy?
Well, particularly when I was in a very intense phase of research for the book, I suppose I would be spending, I don't know, maybe about 6-7 weeks a year there, maybe a little bit more, but spread out over quite a few visits. And I really started spending quite a lot of time in Rome in particular when I got involved as a governor with the British School at Rome, which is which is not a school, it's an academic research institution. And that brought me to Rome on a very, very regular basis. And that's when I really started to ask myself more questions about why Rome is the way it is. And this book was largely driven by my desire just to find out things. But I find that, Italy is an endlessly fascinating country. You can just, no matter how many times you go there and how much time you spend there, you're always scratching the surface of one of the most complex cultures in the world.
And that's very evident. Your love for Italy, and in particular for Rome, comes out through the book. But interesting enough, it starts in 1975 when you were backpacking across Europe with your brother. And you just talk about, you walked around, and of course, the statue we're going to talk about is just behind the Pantheon. But I've read other interviews with you in which you said you weren't that taken by Rome in 1975. You felt it was a bit noisy and chaotic.
Yeah, I didn't like it at all, actually. And I had previously been to other parts of Italy, and one got used to kind of expecting all of Italy to be like Florence or Lucca, very, very pretty and relatively tranquil and contained. And suddenly I arrived in Rome as a student in 1975, and it is huge and chaotic and noisy and slightly grubby. And I just thought, hang on, no, this is not, out of all the cities in Italy, this isn't the one for me, even though it's full of fantastic stuff. And I remember after my brother and I were there for less than 24 hours, we looked at each other and said, we're renting a car and getting the heck out of here. And we fled Rome, and I really didn't go back to Rome for nearly 20 years after that. Even though I was going to Italy constantly, I just avoided Rome like nobody's business.
Actually, it's interesting that it did take you so long to go back. And of course, in more recent times, there's been problems with the civic administration of Rome. I'm thinking in terms of the endless strikes, in terms of rubbish collection and everything else. So perhaps the 70s are still evident on parts of the streets of Rome anyway. Let's go to the book. And it's really at its heart is this amazing relationship between Pope Alexander VII, who I said reigned from 1655 to 1667, and Bernini, the master, the genius. Let's start with the Pope, because he had a very interesting diplomatic career before he even became the Pope. So tell us a little bit about his early years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably useful to remind people about the strange nature of the papacy in the 17th century and earlier. You know, now we think of the Pope, we know the Pope as a great spiritual leader and as the head of the Catholic Church. This, of course, is a role that popes have had since the very beginning. But for most of history, they also had another role, which was being secular monarchs. They were secular rulers of a very important part of central Italy called the Papal States. So on the one hand, the popes were these great spiritual figures. On the other hand, they were pretty sort of hard-nosed political operators. And because of their political significance, they also were able to amass great wealth. And, you know, some of these papal families, like the Barberini, for example, a lot of families that are still around, the Pamphili, amassed enormous treasure chests while they were running the Papal States and also being the spiritual leaders of the church, which has always told people that you know, poverty is not such a bad thing.
Well, that's the great thing about the book, because it's so full of political intrigue. And as you say, the power and the wealth which these guys accumulated and how they looked after their families. I can't think of a modern political leader who has all his family members close by. Can you, off the top of your head?
Yes. No, I mean, it's very much the style of some of today's sort of authoritarian leaders, you know, maybe like a Putin or, you know, or
there you say
others,
Trump.
Others of yes, please let's not mention him.
Okay. Let's go back then to okay, lower the tone.
I don't
we'll
want to lower the tone too much.
Okay, let's go back then to Alexander as a diplomat.
Yeah,
before he became
it's important, you know, when you look at the life of any Renaissance or 17th century Pope to realize that they're playing this dual role. So we have this very clever guy called Fabio Kiji. Now, one of Kiji's sort of collateral ancestors, I think he was like a great uncle or an uncle once removed type of thing, was called Agostino Kiji. And he created a vast fortune and a very important position for himself in Renaissance Rome as the banker to Pope Julius II, because, you know, being the papal banker was quite a good gig in every sense of the word. So Fabio Kiji was the relatively impoverished descendant of a very rich papal banker. He was prodigiously intelligent, a very good student. Like many people who were destined for the church, he also studied law. He was an excellent scholar of Latin. And he went fairly early on, he was tipped to go into the diplomatic service of the papacy. This was a particularly interesting time because with all of today's apocalypse, we sometimes forget that Europe has been through some pretty rough times before.
Yes.
And one of the roughest times, which, you know, sadly few people look at these days, was this period called the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. And it was a time in which Europe was actually torn apart by warfare between Protestant countries and Catholic countries, except sometimes there were Catholic countries allied with the Protestants, and sometimes there were Protestants allied with the Catholics.
That's why a lot of people don't know about this war or don't look at it. It's very complicated.
I mean, it is so complicated. And at any rate, it was also, you know, up until the Great War of 1914, 1918, the 30 Years' War was the greatest catastrophe to strike Europe. There were millions of civilian deaths. And it was really the first time there was large-scale savagery against the civilian population. So it actually tormented Europe. Finally, after about 26 or 27 years, they finally agreed to have a peace conference to try to bring this thing to an end, because everyone was absolutely exhausted, running out of men, running out of money. So a big peace conference was convened, and traditionally the Catholic Church would play a major part in arranging peace between warring states. So this relatively young diplomat, Fabio Kiji, was appointed to be the papal ambassador who was going to help sort out the peace settlement of the 30 Years' War. It was very difficult because, on the one hand, the Protestant diplomats refused to be in the same room, refused to be even in the same city as the Catholic diplomats. They were in a part of Germany where it was raining all the time. Everyone was very unhappy. They spent a lot of time arguing about who had precedent, who should go into the dining room first, all of that sort of stuff. It was an absolute sort of classic diplomatic nightmare. And Fabio Kiji tried to sort it out. But in the end, the peace, as concluded, was really not that great a deal for the Catholic Church. And indeed, it marked the beginning of a very significant waning of the diplomatic powers of the Catholic Church. So Kiji came back to Rome slightly with his tail between his legs, but it was regarded that no one could have solved the problem anyway. It kind of made the Brexit negotiations look like a children's teapot.
That may well turn into a 30-year war yet. Listen, I just want to go to when...
It hasn't, but it feels like it.
I just want to go to when he takes over as Pope, because he had spent these years in difficult diplomatic missions, which took a big toll on his health. He was never particularly strong. He came back very frail, with no teeth, and kidney stone problems.
Yep.
And then he becomes Pope in 1655. And almost the first thing he has to deal with is alarm bells, a plague, a pandemic.
Yes, not dissimilar to today's situation. Yeah, he gets elected Pope in 1655. And he's only in his late 50s, but he is a very old late 50s, because, as you say, he's got no teeth, he's got kidney stones, everything you can think of. And he's elected Pope, A, because he's very popular amongst the various cardinals, and B, with the expectation that he's not going to live long enough to do very much. Because quite often, there were some popes who only reigned for a matter of months or a very few years. But at any rate, he becomes Pope, and almost the first thing that happens is plague strikes Italy, and it strikes Italy very badly. He takes some very good efforts in Rome to protect Rome. He keeps people from coming into Rome. He makes sure that there are enough food supplies. He opens up more hospitals. These are all relatively innovative things in the 17th century. And Rome gets through the plague in reasonably good shape, especially compared to places like Naples. And Kiji is regarded as an extremely good Pope. And I should say, like all popes, he abandons his Christian name of Fabio Kiji and assumes this regnal papal name of Alexander VII. And in spite of his incredible frailty, he reigns as Pope for 12 years. And it's 12 years during which he commands an extraordinary transformation of Rome, because he has this great idea. He has a wonderful idea, and his wonderful idea is this. He recognizes the fact that the political power of the papacy is gone, and he thinks, but I can give us a different sort of power. I can give us a cultural power. I can make Rome the most sought after visitor destination. I can make Rome the place where every civilized European wants to come. And this will give us a different sort of power. And it's what we now call soft power. Rome becomes what we would now call the #1 bucket list destination. And he is able to make this extraordinary transformation because he finds the perfect partner, who is the sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini.
And let's go to Bernini. I mean, it is a tremendous legacy the two of them have left. And of course, the attribution of accomplishment is still disputed to this day. Is it Bernini's Rome or is it Alexander's Rome? But we'll come to that. But Bernini himself had a very long life. He was born, I think, in 1598. He lasted into 1680. And even from a very early age, he was already making waves as a bit of a boy wonder in terms of his ability as a sculptor. And from a very early age, other popes, Urban VIII in particular, recognized his genius, and he started to have real power in the land.
Yeah, he was almost a kind of Mozart, a child prodigy. His significance is such that he's also been described as the Shakespeare of sculpture, you know, the greatest of all time. Really, to me, you know, some people would say, no, it's got to be Michelangelo. You know, to me, when you look at the two, there is still something extra that Bernini brings to the art of sculpture. And it's a feeling of energy, a dynamism, and an extraordinary technical ability to take marble, which is, you know, such a difficult material, and to make the flesh seem like flesh and the cloth feel like cloth. You know, he introduces this incredible technical wizardry to the carving of marble. He creates his first notable works when he's 10, 12, 14 years old, and he immediately is brought to the attention of the Borghese family, who are the papal family at the time. And the popes and the popes' families recognize the value of what we would now call spin, and they use art very consciously. And there's, you know, there's no shame attached to it, or there's no reticence. They use art very consciously to promote themselves, which is unsurprising because they want their families to be enduringly successful. And they also use the art very much as a weapon against Protestantism, as a way of promoting the Catholic Church. And this is something that comes about because in the previous century, the 16th century, the Catholic Church, reeling from the success of the Reformation and Martin Luther, the Catholic Church convenes this major event called the Council of Trent to figure out how to stage the Counter-Reformation. And they do this very successfully. And there is, in fact, even more than the Counter-Reformation, there is a big revival of Catholicism. And one of the things that the Council of Trent very much promotes is the use of art, the visual arts, architecture, music, all of these things, painting, the use of art to encourage people to come into the faith and to understand the faith and to feel more deeply. So the Council of Trent institutionalizes the inspirational value of art, and they desperately need great artists. Bernini is quite obviously going to be the greatest artist of his time, and so he is snapped up by the highest echelons of the Catholic Church, and he spends his whole very long life largely creating phenomenal works of art and architecture under the patronage of a series of popes.
And by the time Pope Alexander takes over in 1655, you say he was already Bernini, this is more famous than Rubens and Rembrandt. I mean, extraordinary. Yeah. And in the 1660s, there was this tug of war between Rome and Paris, the rising power, the French under Louis XIV, who was still very much the boy king at that stage. And there's this great sort of say, no, come to Paris. I can't, I'm busy in Rome. Please come to Paris. No, we demand you come to Paris. And eventually goes to Paris in 1665. And it wasn't a great success. That's a good story.
And I mean, it's kind of almost hard to imagine what this is like, because, for example, nowadays, you can't imagine Donald Trump ringing up Boris Johnson and say, you've got to send David Hockney over. Or, I must have Damien Hirst. It doesn't happen. But in the 17th century, because visual propaganda, you know, remember, this is before the age of mass media, visual propaganda, statues, commemorative coins, buildings were the way in which you conveyed a message. So the monarchs of Europe used to compete with each other to get the best artists. And it's not surprising that, you have an artist, Rubens goes from one court to another, Velasquez goes from Spain to Italy. Artists are moving around all the time because they're very highly sought after. Louis XIV, who is the boy king and the rising boy wonder of Europe, about to become the most powerful man in Europe, decides that he is the most powerful man in Europe. Therefore, he's got to have the best artist, and he's got to have Bernini. So he says to the Pope, send me Bernini. Now, one's also got to bear in mind in these days that if you were an artist, you didn't create a lot of art and then try to find a gallery to sell them. You had to have a patron. Patronage was what was important. And these patrons virtually owned their artists. So Louis XIV couldn't approach Bernini directly. He had to go to the Pope and say, can you please send Bernini to France? And the Pope said, look, he's kind of busy, forget it. Louis says, no, I'm not sure if you realize I'm the King of France. This is quite, this is a big ask. Yes. And no, can't send him. And there's all this to and fro. Finally, the Pope has to relent because Louis is putting so much pressure on him. He almost moves troops to the borders of Italy. So Bernini is dispatched to Paris. And the task that Louis XIV gives him is, I want to build a new extension to my palace, the Louvre. You are now not only the greatest sculptor, but the greatest architect in Europe. Let's have a design. So Bernini comes up with this design for the Louvre, which Louis' courtiers hate. And they hate it because, well, Bernini is Italian, and yes. The French like things French. And Louis' chief advisor, who is called Perrault, P-E-R-R-A-U-L-T, who becomes really most well known to history for having written Little Red Riding Hood. But his day job is advising Louis XIV. It says to Bernini, actually, we don't like this design very much. And Bernini says, you are not fit to wipe the dust off my shoes. This does not well. And
let's leave the arrogance to the French. We do arrogance. you come and play homage to us in the royal court.
Yeah, and Bernini actually is more arrogant than the French. And so he kind of goes back to Rome after 5 or 6 months. Whether he felt it was a failure or whether he felt happy to get out of there, we don't really know. But it's probably the only time in Bernini's life in which he failed to get the commission that was being offered to him.
Yeah, and let's go back then. So he's arrived back in Rome, and this is in late 1665. And the Pope himself are still working on a number of big projects, but they come up with one project that they really want to finish. And this is the core of your book, which is the elephant with the obelisk on his back. And I think it's fair to say, actually, there's a few other characters who come into the story. And this is what makes it so intriguing as to the design of the statue itself. Why an elephant? The design of the elephant? Yeah. Where did they get the obelisk from? And who was this Dominican monk who came in and was trying to call orders? And also the great German Jesuit intellectual. So give us a flavor of what happened when they came up with this idea and how it panned out.
Well, I guess I should say a little bit about obelisks first. Because
huge.
Obelisks are so particularly, although they're particularly Egyptian, they're also particularly Roman. And there are 13 obelisks in Rome. That's more than any city in the world, and more than there are in Egypt. And it all dates back to the ancient Roman conquest of Egypt, when the Emperor Augustus decided he needed to bring a souvenir back to Rome to show that he'd conquered Egypt. He wasn't going to come back wearing a T-shirt that said, I fought. Paperweight. And he thinks, hey, I'm the Emperor of Rome. Get me one of those obelisks and bring it back to Rome. So with immense effort, because these obelisks weigh tens and tens of tons and are also very fragile. with immense effort, he brings the first obelisk back to Rome. And this creates a Roman habit of collecting obelisks and using them to decorate, say, for example, the arena where they had the chariot racing, that sort of stuff. After the fall of the Roman Empire, most of these obelisks collapse, they get damaged, they get buried. And then beginning in the Renaissance, the Italians start rediscovering these obelisks and using them to decorate the city of Rome. So obelisks are this very significant Roman thing. And they're always popping up in strange places. So in 1665, these Dominican, the workmen at a Dominican monastery are installing a new garden wall. And when they're digging the foundations for the garden wall, they hit something really hard, and it turns out to be an obelisk. This is very exciting because it's like a really cool obelisk. And it's the first one that's been found for quite a while. So they need to figure out what to do with it. And the Pope decides, well, let's have not exactly an open competition, but I'll invite a few people to come up with ideas. Of course, Bernini is asked to come up with an idea. And a leading Dominican, Father Paglia, is asked to come up with some ideas, which are really not so good. And the commission goes to Bernini. This earns him a certain amount of animosity with the Jesuits, with the Dominicans, and he doesn't like the Dominicans anyway because all his mates are Jesuits. So there's a bit of a power struggle within these particular holy orders.
Yeah, but when you were saying about the power struggle, and we'll come to the design and towards the end of it, but you had this pulling between them. So the Dominican Paglia was there, this great intellectual, as I mentioned, Kircher, the German Jesuit, who was the self-proclaimed most knowledgeable man in the world and claimed to know everything and wrote these increasingly long and tedious books about Chinese civilization, despite never having been there. He was able to decipher the hieroglyphics on these obelisks, which seem to be largely made up. So they're all putting in their own twopence worth, if you like, into the design.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of. I mean, you mentioned that this extraordinary man, Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, who was regarded as the most intelligent man in the world, and every time he was asked to do something, someone said to him, "Would you write a book?" And say, "I don't know anything about China." And he then put out like a 1,000-page book online. One of his obsessions was deciphering the hieroglyphs, because everyone thought that Egyptian hieroglyphs, if they could be deciphered, all these incredible mystical secrets about life and the world, etc., etc. So Kircher spends decades churning out these huge books about the meaning of the hieroglyphs, none of which make any sense at all. But he was kind of an exemplary expert, because he thought, well, if I tell everyone I'm the world's most intelligent man, I'm the go-to expert, they're going to believe me. And they did. I mean, Kircher had this amazing power.
He would have been a great social media influencer on the intellectual channel, which would be a minority channel these days.
Yeah, he was just like that. And, there were quite a few other intellectuals who kept saying, actually, what this guy's talking is nonsense. But the prevailing view was that he was the go-to intellectual in Europe, especially for the papacy. And he worked with Bernini and Pope Alexander VII on a new way of presenting this newly found obelisk to the public. And hence we have this wonderful statue in the Piazza della Minerva in Rome, in which the obelisk is being carried on the back of an elephant. And this turns out to be Bernini's most personal tribute to his great friend Alexander VII.
Now, you say it's Bernini's most personal tribute, but you do acknowledge that there's still question marks over how directly he was involved, partially because of these other guys sitting around the table. And indeed, when it was unveiled a few weeks after the death of Pope Alexander in the local newspaper, it was said it was the work of the Dominican. And even his own son's biography didn't list it in the catalogue of Bernini's work. So there's still a tinge of doubt as to, was it really his work?
I think the reason that his son's biography of Bernini didn't list it is that he regarded it as a very minor work. But I've been, I did some work in the library at Windsor Castle, who have one of the world's great collections of Bernini drawings. And I have seen all the original Bernini drawings for this. There is also, from a period of about 25 years earlier, there's also a model of this, which is now in the collection of the Corsini family. And I've seen that model. So it's pretty clear that even though contemporaries were unsure, that Bernini did the design himself.
And the importance of elephants actually in Roman history, because this goes back to the time of some of the emperors, and the elephant as a symbol of piety. But also there had been more recent examples of elephants turning up in Rome in the 16th as well as the 17th century.
Yeah. Elephants were often brought to Western Europe as a sort of tourist attraction, and they were kind of an exotic gift. You know, for example, I mean, way back around 800, the Emperor Charlemagne was given an elephant. Pope Leo X was given an elephant as a present by the King of Portugal. And then in Bernini's own lifetime, and also there was another elephant touring Europe that was drawn by Rembrandt. You know, these elephants were, remember, this is, you know, long before Netflix. What are we going to do tonight? Oh, let's pay a shilling and go and look at an elephant. So, you know, elephants were used as popular entertainment. So they had there was an awareness amongst the public of the exotic and extraordinary nature of elephants. And also, as you say, elephants had a symbolic value because they were meant to be very spiritual animals. They were meant to be very sexually restrained. And that was something that was looked upon very admirably at the time. So they had a lot of symbolic values, and of course their intelligence and their very good memory. And Bernini's elephant is almost, I mean, it has been considered by some people to be quite a reasonable caricature of Pope Alexander VII, because it's about the most human-looking elephant you'll ever find.
Yes. And also his eyes, particularly his right eye. And this is something you say, you know, reflected from when he was a boy, Bernini, that he was bringing human feelings, empathy into the sculpture for the first time. And in this elephant, he says there is almost a human touch to it, which makes it stand out.
Yeah, the elephant, I mean, it very quickly became one of the most beloved landmarks in Rome. And it's gratifying that even today, whenever you go into this little square of the Minerva, there are always crowds around the elephant taking pictures of it, because it's so empathetic. In a city of immense grandeur, you know, sometimes the grandeur of Rome is so great that you just can't take it anymore. In a city of immense grandeur, this is a very humane and very humorous tribute to a pope. And, you know, there's nothing like it anywhere else in the world.
You say the humor. We've talked about the face of the elephant. Do you want to talk about the rear of the elephant? Because that's also attracted a lot of comment down through the centuries.
Yeah, the elephant's bum is very important because when they were deciding, and, you know, there was a lot of discussion about, okay, so we've got this elephant. It's going to go into the square of the Minerva, but where exactly in the square is it going to go? And there are a few surviving drawings which show different places where it could have gone. In the end, they decide that they are going to place it with its bum facing the Dominican monastery. And actually, no, they're going to do something better than that. Bernini is going to change the design slightly so that the elephant's tail is swished off to the side, and it looks as if the elephant is just about to defecate right.
What, I could imagine the Dominican looking out at that statue and wondering, how the hell did this get past
Yeah, how did we
the
let
Pope?
this happen? But what was interesting, Gerry, is the fact that the 17th century is a fascinating century because it's long enough away to be really weird, but it's sort of close enough to us so that we can understand the way people behave.
Yeah.
And one of the we often think of people in the past as always being, I don't know, terribly serious about everything. They're very religious, they're all very serious. 17th century Italy in particular, even the most aristocratic people and the most intellectual people were obsessed with practical jokes. They had very dirty sense of humor. It was a pretty wild time, actually. And
Bernini himself wrote a few bawdy plays with practical jokes.
Yeah, he wrote plays. He loved practical joking. It was a time of sort of tremendous exuberance and fun.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the scale of his work, as you say, he's responsible for so many, classic landmarks all around Rome in the Baroque style. But he had a workshop as well. He employed a lot of other sculptors, including famously a guy called Ferrata, I think is how you pronounce it, who was the main sculptor on this elephant sculpture and everything else. And you talk about the delegation of artistic power. So he was the big ideas man at this stage, but he obviously didn't necessarily do every last piece, just as Rubens and Rembrandt had a factory of people who were working with them.
Yeah, all the the big names in art at this period began having very large scale workshops. So for example, when you look at very large paintings by Rubens or Van Dyck, quite usually they would have someone in their workshop who was the sort of fabric painter, who did all the sort of fancy costumes. Another person might paint the landscape in the background. There'd be another person who was very good at painting dogs or other sorts of animals. So there was a huge, huge delegation going on in these great artistic workshops. And I think Rubens was probably the most important pioneer of this style of working. Bernini was in such demand, and the scale of the projects that he was doing for the Catholic Church, including, as it were, redecorating most of St. Peter's Basilica, a big project. The scale of work was so great that he employed almost every well-known sculptor in Rome at one time or another. And that helped also to spread the Bernini style, because these sculptors learned to work in the style of Bernini, and then went off not only all over Italy, but all over Europe. His number one assistant at this time was a very talented sculptor called Ercole Ferrata. And Ferrata was not a terribly original sculptor, but he was very, very, very technically sophisticated. And he is the one who actually carved the elephant to Bernini's specifications. And, he also worked on, for example, we see, the famous bridge, the Bridge of Sant'Angelo in Rome, which has these wonderful sculptures conceived by Bernini, but mostly carved by members of his workshop. So it was a very usual thing to do in those days. Just as you wouldn't expect an architect to actually build the building himself. Often, the big, busy artists were very good at delegation.
And talking of delegation, let me draw it to the present day. Are you, in a sense, then, when it comes to the business, are you the Bernini of pasta sauces? That you come up with these lovely ideas, the recipes, and then you send it out to the worker bees in the factory to mass produce for us all to enjoy? Don't be shy about this one.
That is an extraordinarily good and very flattering analogy, which I will accept with enthusiasm.
Well, yeah. Well, that's good to know. So continuing in the earlier stages of Bernini, so we've got to the end. He loses his big patron, but he does manage to get work from some of the other popes. But I mean, by this stage, his productivity is really beginning to tail off a little bit. His private life, as far as we can establish, wasn't entirely without blemish. Particularly, he got involved in what turned out to be a very nasty three-way fight for the affections of the wife of one of his workers.
Yes, yes, who appears to really have been the great love of his life. She was called Costanza, and he was so in love with her that he does something that had never happened before in the whole history of art. He carves a life-size marble bust of her. And this is revolutionary because, you know, carving a marble bust is quite a big deal. It's very expensive. It's very time-consuming. It's very difficult. So therefore, you only had marble busts of gods and goddesses, kings and queens, or great aristocrats. For the first time in history, there is a marble bust of an ordinary woman, because Costanza is an ordinary woman. And in the carving itself is very interesting because she's slightly disheveled. You know, she's got a bit of a bedhead. She's not wearing a feather frock. So she's the great love of his life. Unfortunately, as you say, she happens to be married to one of his then favorite assistants. So that's rather complicated. And then Bernini finds out that she's also having an affair with one of Bernini's brothers. So, you know, he goes slightly bananas and hires a thug to slash Costanza's face with a razor, because, of course, this being the 17th century, of course, it's always the woman's fault. You know, it's not the guy's fault. It's always the woman's fault in the 17th century. So he rather disreputably hires someone to assault her. He then chases his brother around the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore and tries to kill him, but doesn't quite succeed. But he does break a couple of his ribs. And the brother is then banished, is sent abroad. And Bernini's punishment is he's ordered to get married to a respectable woman. And so Bernini gets married, they have a lot of children, and he then spends a lot of time praying. You know, he becomes very ostentatiously devout. So he's a hot-blooded guy. He is a hot-blooded guy, but he's so, he's really so driven by work that he doesn't really have much time to spend with his family. And he probably doesn't have much time to spend on anything other than work and hanging out with the Pope of the day, because he liked being very close to the popes he was working for.
Wise move, and it paid off. We're coming towards the end. We've still got a few more minutes, but it's been a fascinating insight into the book, and it's full of those great stories, because it really is a very human story, a very political drama, as well of high artistic merit. And I just want to remind people, actually, that you're watching Loyd Grossman at the Harrogate Literature Festival. If you want to make a donation, and please do, you can text HIF and the amount to 70085. That's 70085, or online at harrogateinternationalfestivals.com. As you say, Bernini had a fair few children, only one of whom took up the family business. And it's fair to say he certainly didn't inherit his dad's genius.
No, it's rather sad that the only child who wanted to be a sculptor just wasn't very good. It's not surprising he didn't inherit his dad's genius, because that sort of genius doesn't really seem to be hereditary. And,
yes.
Bernini was a once-in-a-century type of occurrence. And also, I mean, rather sadly, and Bernini sensed this towards the end of his life, he often said that, you know, when I die, my reputation will die with me. And indeed, there was a period of, you know, some couple of 100 years where Bernini was not very highly thought of. It's only really in the 20th century that Bernini was kind of reappraised as the great artist and architect he was. And, you know, it just shows that even the greatest talents go in and out of fashion.
And you mentioned previously that he was pretty confident, some would say arrogant in terms of his own ability, but like all great artists, he also had moments of doubt as to the quality of his work and the longevity of his work, which you referred to there. And also his great patron, the Pope, used to actually sleep with a coffin in his bedroom to remind him of the mortality of men.
Yeah, they had they were pretty death obsessed, actually. There's no question about that. And I think Bernini's career also shows us that a lot of great artists, endowed with this extraordinary talent, also have a certain sort of childishness. There is a selfishness and insecurity, a constant need to be reassured about how brilliant they are, and plagued by doubts. The most important artist of his century, probably financially the most important and successful artist of his century as well, yet very, very insecure, needing constant praise and reassurance, and also not reticent about telling people what a genius he was.
And right at the end of the book, when you've told the story, you also provide a travel guide, where you actually tell people, here's how you walk around Rome and see all these obelisks, if we're ever allowed to travel again. You must be missing travel, because apart from Rome, you genuinely travel a lot normally.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that as we can't travel abroad, it's also given me, and I think a lot of people, a great opportunity to do more traveling around this country. And it is a reminder that however much we love abroad, we should treasure the fact that this country is so extraordinarily culturally rich, so beautiful in terms of its landscape. And in spite of all my love of Italian food, I should also remind people that the food we get in this country now is pretty outstanding. So there's been a certain upside about not being able to go abroad.
I wonder if a certain TV program had any role to play in increasing the standard and quality and diversity of food. But we'll leave that for 1 second. Just one other thing, when you were talking about the discovering our own country more. Neither of us, of course, I'm Irish, you're American, but we're lucky to live in beautiful parts of the UK. You're also chair of the Royal Parks, and open spaces have become even more important in terms of people who don't have the luxury of having a garden or somewhere to go to. So this is an important time for the Royal Parks.
It's an extraordinarily important time. And, even before the pandemic, I was very concerned about people's access to open space, especially in London, but to a certain extent in other places around the country. Space has become privatized, space has become monetarized, and a situation has arisen in which it's only the most privileged people who seem to have availability to, that vital access to space. The Royal Parks, and indeed municipal parks and national parks all over the country, have the most important role to play in terms of giving people access to nature, and also in being safe spaces where everyone is kind of equal. Everyone is equal in a park, and we're all citizens in a park. It's one of the few places where we can express our sense of community, and that is worth defending at all costs.
Important point to make. So, Loyd, it's traditional almost at the end of a conversation about an author to ask him or her what the next project might be. Have you moved on to something else?
I am working pretty hard on an aspect of Paris. And
has Louis XIV or his successor called upon you to say, we must have Loyd Grossman in Paris? He's been on to the Prime Minister.
Sort of thing. But it's very early days yet.
Okay. Okay, well, that's a treat yet to come. So don't forget, if you want to find out about 17th century Rome, an elephant in Rome, there's so much in this book. Loyd Grossman, it's been a real delight to talk to you at the Harrogate Literature Festival. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerry.